Hello and welcome to Weekly MTG. I'm your host, Blake Rasmussen, and we are here with our regularly scheduled BNR discussion. It's going to be a bit of a different one today because we didn't do much, which is a good thing, to be very clear. When we don't do much, that means formats are generally in a good place. So we are going to talk about the one change we did make yesterday, but we're going to spend the bulk of the time kind of doing an overview of primarily the tabletop formats to check in on where R&D feels the formats are at, what they're keeping an eye on, what they're looking for, and of course, answering your questions. Before we get to our two guests today, I want to note, one, thank you to everyone who put questions online and had topics for us to consider. I want to make sure that we know what we're talking about here. We're talking about game design and what cards you can play. We got a lot of questions about Pioneer support specifically and tournament support. That is a different but related team and different but related topic for what tournaments hold and what formats. So that's more about the where and the when you can play. This is more about the what you can play. So we're going to focus on that. We're not going to have any news on future Pioneer tournaments or any other formats, format support like that. Instead, we're going to talk about the cards. We're going to talk about the cards and how they interact with each other and what they do. And to do that, we have two fantastic guests who are going to look familiar. We've got Jadine and Carmen. Welcome.
Hello. Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah.
Howdy, gamers.
So, regular guests for these BNR streams. So we're going to go through the formats kind of. We're going to start at standard, work our way to vintage, and we'll throw some questions in as we go.
Whoa, I heard there was a ban. What if we
There was a ban, so I'm getting ahead of myself. I've actually played with this card a little bit, so I shouldn't forget.
You were talking about it.
I
before.
was.
You said 30 seconds.
I know, 30
Blake
seconds
literally
ago.
just
I've already lost
okay,
the
hold on.
thread. Thanks for keeping. We're going to start over. Hi, everyone. Welcome to No. Yes, thank you. Let's talk about the one ban that we did have in Historic, which was Food Chain, which I don't think shocked many people. Here is Food Chain. You know, all it does is add mana. You got exile creatures. Doesn't seem that bad. What's going on here?
It adds mana a few different times, or a gajillion different times, and you can keep making new creatures. So there's a combo deck in Historic that could win as early as the second turn, I believe, where it would play a mana creature, then use that to play Food Chain on turn 2, exile the mana creature, cast Guardian of Angel, which is a card that conjures a copy of itself the turn that it enters. That you can cast that turn, which effectively lets you make infinite mana, and then once you have infinite mana, it's fairly academic to win from there. Generally, this is something where it saw a really high win percentage, and it was climbing the metagame share of basically every level of the queue at a meteoric rate, and we just kind of wanted to get out ahead of that one.
Yeah, and you mentioned Evangel, but there were several flavors of Food Chain that got played as well. We saw Goblin Food Chain, which was an old classic.
You were playing that on stream recently?
I played it on stream, yeah. It was just kind of, hey, let's check this thing out. And then we just kind of crushed with it. It was great. There was also, I think, some Eldrazi flavors of Food Chain as well, because that has the infinite combo with the, I forget what it's called, the 3-mana one that can be cast from exile, much like Squee. Yeah. Eternal Scourge?
Oh, Eternal Scourge.
Eternal Scourge.
Mental Magic All-Star.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh man, don't get me started on Mental Magic. So anyway.
See you after the show.
Now you were saying something before the show about this existing in the format for a little bit and how typically the arena team is preferred to pre-ban things like this.
Yeah, I actually think that this situation is a really good example of what can go wrong whenever a card is not pre-banned. I know that's something that the team has gotten a little bit of criticism for over the years, but for the most part, pre-bans are trying to prevent this sort of scenario where while we saw this go up in metagame share, we also saw the number of players who wanted to play Historic go down over time.
Yep.
And it's really clear, at least from where we are sitting, that Food Chain is something that made Historic less fun to play almost immediately just by existing. So this scenario is one where even in the world where we get out ahead of it pretty quickly, there's still just a couple of weeks where it kind of sucks to play Historic.
Yeah.
We really don't want to live in the world where that is true.
Yep.
We think Historic's a lot of fun, and it's something that we've put a lot of work into curating over time. I know there was a lot of change in it recently to try and set it up to be a fun format. So this is something where it makes a lot of sense from where I'm sitting, at least, to see very fast action be taken and continue on course of trying to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the first place.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. I like you mentioned, I tried it out on the stream. I was like, hey, this looks like fun, and it crushed. And then after that, my interest was in I goldfished it against Sparky a few times because it gave the same feeling.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, otherwise.
The decks play pretty samey at the end of the day. And
They do,
that's not
yeah.
always true, but especially whenever it can win as early as it does, it doesn't feel that differently to click through food chain on turn 2 or 3, whether it's with Eldrazi or goblins or mana creatures and so on.
There's a really cool 5 minutes with super powerful broken stuff, but
Yes.
it doesn't last much longer
Yes.
than 5 minutes.
Exactly. And if you still want to play it, if it was something you enjoyed, it's still legal and timeless.
That's true. They won't even arrest you.
Yeah.
That's just legal.
No, they won't say anything in Timeless. Timeless 'tis a silly place. I love playing Timeless. I've been playing Affinity a lot lately. It's great. Okay, let's move on to Standard, and let's check in on that format. So no changes, obviously, but what are you looking at and thinking about in Standard right now?
Yeah, no changes. Very happy to be in a spot with no changes after kind of the tumultuous period at the end of last year that culminated in banning 3 cards in November. Ever since then, the format has been kind of rebounding. I generally think formats just require time, especially when they're in a bad state that players to fall off of them. It'll take time for players to get back into it, to want to engage again after they got burned to some extent. But happy to say that Standard is showing signs of kind of coming back here and seeing renewed interest from the player base. I think the format was somewhat holding its breath after Corey Steelcutter into Vivi of, hey, is there going to be another big power outlier that is going to cause the format to be really not fun? And it looked for a little bit like it might be Badger Mole Cub, but at this point, I think it is pretty safe to say Badger Mole Cub has a place in the format, but it is not clearly above the rest of the format, which is really great to see.
There's the little guy.
Yeah, there he is. So Pro Tour Lorwyn eclipsed, and at the regional championships before that, the narrative was Badger Mole Cub is the strongest thing to do, running away with the format. Then it kind of got beat up. In fact, Badger Mole Cub is the strongest card and the most powerful boogeyman of a format to ever get beat up quite so much. It just kind of keeps having not great showings at the big events as people find ways to beat it. The fact that ultimately this is a 2/2 creature for 2 that is answerable by shock is something that is really helping us and help the format adapt to it. So we've seen a format develop that is on one side of the aisle, Badger Mole Cub decks looking to make a ton of mana and be super powerful. And then on the other side, just a huge swath of different ways of interactive strategies that are doing their own thing and can answer the cub and have been finding success. And those two sides have been battling back and forth a bit, and we keep seeing new developments and new churn, and it is pretty cool to see. Standard from a top level is doing a lot of the things that we want Standard to be doing. We have many different decks in the format. The other section in the metagame grid is fairly healthy and larger than it is in a lot of formats. The decks are distinct from each other and have clear identities, which is something that is really important to us. And just the overall diversity of the format looks really healthy. So pretty happy there. Gameplay of the format, I know we've talked about like speed of Standard some.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. There are ways to improve. So we're at a BNR stream right now, but the banned list is on our minds, and we chose not to take any action. It turns out the banned and restricted list is the most blunt tool at our disposal for format management. And there's a lot of things we care about when it comes to curating a format and making a good experience. And the tool of last resort is BNR, and the very fair problems that people have in Standard and the ways that it's not as enjoyable as it could be are problems that are not best solved with a ban event.
Okay.
They are stuff that we are looking to do better in the future, design cards differently, find good answers, slow down the format a little bit. So that's kind of change that we are looking for over time, because the fundamental state of the format is that it is pretty fun and pretty good, and there's a lot of things that can have success.
Okay.
And on that note, something that I think is unique about Standard and great in a lot of ways is that because things do rotate over time, the whatever we do on the design side actually is something that does course correct in a very observable way.
Absolutely.
Now, we got a lot of questions on the speed of the format and how you even doing that. Obviously, you can't talk about future designs or anything like that, but what are the sort of tools and things you think about when you think about slowing a format down?
Yeah, so first let's talk about what we even mean by the format being too fast, because you can play Standard games that have many, many turns in them. So largely when we talk about speed of the format, what we're talking is how much pressure you are under to take a specific game action how early in the game. Like, I think often the fundamental question of Standard right now is, can you answer the Badger Mole Cub on turn 2? If you are on the draw, that means you need to have exactly a 1-mana card and an untapped land that can cast it to answer Badger Mole Cub in a like kind of efficient way.
Yeah.
And the Badger Mole Cub decks, if you leave them unchecked, can actually end the game on turn 3. So you kind of are pushed into needing to respect it and needing to have early answers, which warps your deck building and kind of eliminates a bunch of stuff that you can't really do in the format because you can't afford to play that many tap lands, or you have to have the most efficient thing possible. So it's not that every game in Standard is ending on turn 4 or turn 5, or even like very many of them, but that potential is there, and that potential is making the games less fun and making people respect it. So a lot of this is taking a good hard look at our threats low on the curve, looking at the cards that we're making in the future that, like Badger Mole Cub, have the potential to warp formats around them and say, hey, are we happy with where on the curve this is? Are we happy if you have to think about answering this card as like a fundamental question that the format is asking you, and are we going to be happy with how that warps the environment, and kind of just putting less power in 2-mana standalone threats, thinking a lot about the density and strength of how many 1-mana threats we give you, and just kind of somewhat shifting up the curve of threats in the format.
I am curious your thoughts on a sort of back and forth I've been seeing online around Badger Mole Cub. There are those who are like, ban this card, it is making the format too fast. And there are others who are saying, well, without Badger Mole Cub, where is green even? Like, what is green even doing? And the format collapses from there. Where are you on the spectrum, or do you think about it differently?
No, I kind of think about it just like that. In fact, we had an internal conversation about it last week of just, this card is doing a lot of good in the format from one perspective. I think I spent 2 years before Badger Mole Cub talking about how we wished green would be stronger in the format, and we're trying to make that happen. But things just weren't quite landing right. A lot of cards were a little too weak. Green couldn't keep up with what the other colors were doing. Badger Mole Cub has fixed that problem. Green is, once again, a really important part of the Standard metagame. That's important. Color balance is important. Players, if green is your favorite color and you can't play green in Standard, why would you be interested in playing Standard? And that's something we care about a lot. Badger Mole Cub puts too much pressure on the game too early. It is a more demanding card than we were like. The ceiling is somewhat too high. So there are very clear positives and very clear negatives. I personally land on overall it is good for the format. I think the diversity we've managed to see with Badger Mole Cub is creating a format that is pretty fun. It's not perfect, and I don't think it's that important we impose an exact moral judgment on if it's better to exist or not exist, but it is doing something good, and in the future we'll find ways to achieve that good with less of the problems.
Okay. Let's move on to Pioneer, and if anyone in chat has questions about Standard, we'll come back to questions at the end, and we can cover them then. But I want to talk about Pioneer, and again, setting aside tournaments or anything like that, but what are you all seeing right now in Pioneer as far as metagame churn, cards being played, that sort of thing?
So I would say the top of the Pioneer metagame. First, let me say that I think the format looks a lot of fun, and there are a lot of different macro strategies present. But the top of the format kind of falls into one of two different buckets. One of them is various flavors of red. Red, I would say, is the most played color in the format by a decent amount, but the ways that it gets played are pretty different from deck to deck, and not just in the cards that it plays, but the ways that the deck plays. So in some ways, we're seeing some versions of the Is It Lessons deck from Standard. We're actually seeing some combining of the Lessons package from Avatar: The Last Airbender with the Learn Lessons stuff that's going on in original Strixhaven, which is pretty cool to see, especially with SOS coming up in just a couple of weeks, months. Time
It's an
is
illusion.
Next week is our debut for Seekers of Strixhaven.
be there. Sorry. All right, so you'll see cards like Academic Dispute, I believe is the one that is basically a very cheap way of sort of building your own tutor for lessons out of the sideboard that are kind of intended to be balanced around the notion that you can play them in your main deck. Then there's also basically the very straightforward red aggro deck. This is your Monastery Swiftspear, Monstrous Rage, Screaming Nemesis. Sometimes Corey Steelcutter is there, sometimes it's Slickshot Show Off. It can vary a little bit. Sometimes it's Splashing Blue for Storm Chaser's talent for the sake of a little more resiliency. But this is something kind of close to what we were seeing in Standard 6 months, a year ago. And then there's the Arclight Phoenix decks, which we've kind of come to expect over the last entire time that Pioneer has existed. Artist Talent, still great in that sort of show. Treasure Cruise going in and out of the deck, which is really interesting to think about. But all of those decks play very differently, and despite all of them including red, they don't really play very many of the same cards, which is really interesting.
Okay. What's the other column?
Greasefang.
Greasefang. Okay.
Greasefang.
Yeah.
So this is one that, again, basically since it was released, we've seen this see a lot of play in Pioneer, specifically bringing back Parhelion 2 out of War of the Spark as a sort of, this isn't literally killing you this turn, but this 3 mana is providing an insurmountable advantage that is going to kill you on the following turn. You know, that's a rounding error, right? It generally plays out that way. Over the last year or so, we've seen 2 different camps of Greasefang evolve over time. So one of them is just an Orzhov version of the deck. So this is something that I think originally was popularized by how strong it was to play any of the 2 mana, discard a card, I become indestructible threats that we give to white. Recently we gave black one of these in Lorwyn Eclipsed as well. That, with Sheltered by Ghosts out of Duskmourn, was an incredibly strong package against all of the red aggressive strategies that we saw when Heartfire Hero was still legal. And it's also gotten some new tools like Monument to Endurance in the last year or so, where it's more of a discard-focused mid-range deck than it is necessarily leaning that hard on the combo. It's nice when it comes up, but you have a perfectly respectable fair game on that's kind of a bit more efficient and aggressive. On the other side of things, you do still have that traditional sort of Abzan-focused version that's using a bunch of ways of milling your deck and things like that. We've seen things that play the dual role of mill card / interactive piece, like Witherbloom Command as an example. Formidable Speaker is something that lets you discard your vehicle and then search up the Greasefang, which is coming up out of Lorwyn Eclipsed recently. These are both different versions of Greasefang that can frequently end games in a similar and threatening way, but in the games where they don't have Greasefang, they play out pretty differently. And in the games where the opponent has Graveyard Hate, they play out pretty differently. But given how strong the Greasefang package and a lot of what it's doing are against the color red and just trying to go over the top of it, that's sort of what's really defining the tippy top of the metagame is 5 or 6 decks that kind of stem out from those 2 buckets.
Okay. What else are you seeing in the metagame outside those kind of major?
Honestly, a lot of control. You're seeing some Lotus Field. I want to say the challenge last night was won by Selesnya Collective
Company. Yeah,
just honestly, really a lot of different stuff that you can do.
Yeah.
It's something I love about a lot of the Magic Online challenges that you'll see is you'll see a top 8 with I would say between 6 and 8 different decks pretty frequently, which is a really fun place for a non-rotating format to be. In a lot of ways, it's a spot, or I would say it is very close to what you want out of any non-rotating format, where you want a defined top of the metagame, where if you want to go to a competitive tournament, play something for stakes, then you know who the boogeyman is, you know what it is that you need, what the litmus test is that your deck needs to beat in order for you to be successful. But it's open enough that you can choose how you are doing that. Your tools are very customizable. We have a bunch of macro archetypes that are represented, and we have a bunch of things that have been format mainstays for a long time, like Arclight Phoenix, like Greasefang, cards where you see it and go, oh, if I fall in love with a strategy, this can just be what I do in Magic every Friday night for as long as I want. And I think that's one of the wonderful promises of an Eternal format.
I do need to ask, I'm going to channel the internet here. You focused a lot on Greasefang in that section. Why was that?
So this is something where I think you're alluding to the article a little bit.
The article,
well.
from
So
yesterday.
some of this is on Greasefang in the Pioneer section, and I'll also acknowledge that I did this a little bit with Living in the article, and we're going to do it in the show a little bit too, where we are shifting from last year's model of having to write 2 BNR articles a year. We ended up writing a third. To having to write 7. So that's one every 6 or 7 weeks on average. If you understand that the Wizards offices close in December, so I'm going to kind of write those ones off. We're looking at about 7 articles in 49-ish weeks. It is really hard to toe the line between just repeating yourself over and over and over and not wanting to also just look like you're writing the deck of the week or something like that. I think I personally in my own writing skewed a little bit too far towards the deck of the week style of writing, where I really, really do want players to know that those of us in the building are paying attention to formats as they develop. We care a lot about new stuff as it hits the format. Literally before this show was looking at yesterday's Pioneer results in the challenges, and we want players to feel seen and heard as things change in the format. And I don't want them to feel like we're just going, well, things were fine last time, this had a Pro Tour or something like that, and we're just going to keep assuming that that is true. A lot of that is trying to find that balance between acknowledging what is happening right now with a broader macro format overview. Again, I am happy to acknowledge, I think I missed the mark a little bit tonally on this one, but so much of this, especially the last couple of years, has been finding our footing and the right balance on this, and I think we're on a really good path. Overall, I think things have improved a lot from where we were 2 years ago, and this is just another step on that journey.
Okay. Well, so that's a pretty good transition into Modern, because you're not saying Living End is the best thing to do. It was more just like, hey, this popped up. It's not new, it's old, but it's also new.
But a challenge, I want to say it was over the weekend. The thing I cited in the article was winning a showcase challenge, which is really competitive in terms of playing for stakes on Magic Online. Living End is something that also kind of ticks that box of it's been around forever, but it's getting new tools.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into Modern and do what. Give us again an overview of Modern. How are we looking at Modern right now?
Sure. So overall, Modern is a little bit closer to, or it is very close to what we like to see in an Eternal format. That stability with the upper level, that sort of upper crust of what you have to fight against. But then a lot of different macro strategies that can find success week over week. I would say the last few months, Red-White in particular, so that is both Boros Energy and some of the Jeskai Blink stuff, has been a bit more omnipresent than we would generally like. But I would say Modern in the last year or so has been really close to what we think is the ideal Eternal format. It has that obvious carved out upper level, but then we've seen what is good in the metagame change a lot month to month, and it can be hard to figure out when it is you want to actually use that last resort of banning versus letting something ride out. I know whenever we saw Modern as a tabletop format at the regional championship level and even at the RCQ level, we saw Boros Energy do significantly worse. In part because it's generally been a dog to Amulet Titan, which is quite hard to execute on Magic Online. So when you remove that counter pressure and people want to log on to Magic Online and just say, hey, I'm going to enter a tournament. I naturally don't want to feel like I'm spewing a bunch of my own tournament equity. This is a fine choice. It ends up sort of becoming an Ouroboros eating its own tail in some ways. And without a counter pressure to stop it from doing that, it's very hard to get away from it.
So just to make sure, because we got a question sort of in this vein here. So what you're saying is the MitGo data of Boros representation doesn't match real life primarily because Amulet Titan has different levels of play across each.
Right, that's a big part of it. And that's not the whole story of Modern, to be totally clear, but I do want to get out and just immediately acknowledge the sort of elephant in the room that I would say if Boros were anywhere near its current metagame share, once we start having paper tournaments or something like that, that's when we'd start having real conversations about, okay, what are we going to do about this? It might be by way of bans, it may be by way of unbans. Some of this is exploring our options.
Yeah.
But at this point, it is hard to tell if we are in the couple of months where Boros is really good and then the format has the tools to self-correct over time and continue this organic churn that we like to see in a format like this, or if truly people have figured out how to make these Sacred Foundry decks too strong and it's time for us to intervene.
Okay. Talk about what else are you seeing going on, because you were mentioning Surveillance Cam and some other new things going on.
All right, cool. The Surveillance Cam. I'm pumped to talk about this one. So this is one where I think we've seen a couple of finishes and challenges at this point. I know there's at least one where there is an artifact combo deck that is reminiscent of the Underworld Breach decks from last year. Yeah. Stay with me. Stay with me. Significantly weaker. It doesn't have Underworld Breach, but it uses a combo of Surveillance Cam, Imri, Lurker in the Lock, Grinding Station, and then also any sort of mana-producing Mox. We're going to have Mox Opal or Graphic. Mox Amber also works for this combo since it taps for blue if you control an Imri. And you use this to mill your entire deck or mill your opponent's entire deck. It doesn't really matter that much. It can if they have an Eldrazi or something like that. But this is something that is a much harder combo to execute than the Underworld Breach one, which wasn't held back by, say, Summoning Sickness, like this one is with a copy of Imri, Lurker of the Lock. There are ways to get around that, of course. There are equipment that grant haste and so on. But given that this is harder to assemble, in a lot of ways, we feel happy that this looks like it can be the spiritual successor to the previous Grinding Station Breach decks that we saw, because whenever we ban a card, it is not that we want to kill an archetype. It is that we are sort of acknowledging that something is generally so strong within the context of the environment itself that it's making it less fun, and it's an attempt to depower it. In some cases, the card Underworld Breach is a really hard to replace effect, which means that the deck might evaporate and there is no other choice. But as you can see from this sort of deck, it is possible for it to come back over time, and you still can then play your Tamio Urza Saga artifact package backed up by Malevolent Rumble, if that's how you want to do it. You want as many different kinds of decks to exist in these formats as possible, but making sure that it's possible that they aren't pushing out other decks is the real trick. So I'm optimistic that if you think this is fun, it's something that can be strong enough to hang. It's just not going to be putting up the kind of win rate and meta share that we saw from the Underworld Breach decks 9-12 months ago.
Time is a construct. Who knows?
Thank you.
All right.
Urza Saga makes time.
Urza Saga does it all. We have gotten a lot of questions, so and this is a normal conversation when Modern's in a place like this that seems relatively stable. What about unbans? Was there any discussion of unbans in Modern?
Yes. So that one is complicated where there are a few things going on. I think the fact that there have been a bunch of no ban list Modern events going on in Magic Online is part of what has catalyzed this conversation. And I just want to say, first off, explicitly, I don't think that things being appropriate in that format is a sign that they are appropriate in ban list Modern. That format has things as powerful as Eye of Ugin, Chrome Mox, Mental Misstep, etc. Something being appropriate in a format that has Chrome Mox and Mental Misstep is not emblematic of how appropriate it would be in another format. So just going ahead, addressing that one, moving on to things that are more actionable on the Modern front. So frequently, we want to make these changes for a reason and not just because we can. I would say I personally don't really subscribe to the notion that ban lists should be as small as possible inherently. It doesn't always feel this way, but basically every time we unban something does incur some level of risk. And it is not free, right? I think a lot of players can kind of feel like, oh, you know, we don't know that Umezawa's GT or whatever. You will figure out whatever card it is that we want to talk about later on, but that or a Glimpse of Nature or whatever it is, I'm confident that this would be fine. In the, let's even say 5% world that it isn't, it can be pretty disastrous. I think you were actually talking to me a little bit about the costs of bans and how that relates to unbans recently.
Right. I mean, in general, banning a card is a big decision that we know incurs a lot of cost on players. Just takes away the thing they were enjoying, means they have to go out and find a new deck to play, and it can really shift the way they engage with Magic. It's a pretty heavy cost. And it's pretty natural to go, okay, you can pay the cost when you're banning a card, and then when you're unbanning a card, you unpay that cost. But like, you don't get the same thing back. When Bloodbraid Alpha and Jace the Mind Sculptor get unbanned in Modern, it's not the same thing as when they got banned for the first time. You don't get all of that original joy and love and people with intact decks that they know how to play just immediately back like nothing happened. So bans are really costly, and unbans can provide benefits to the format, but it's not on the same level necessarily as the cost of a ban. And when we unban something and then have to ban it again, we can just end up in a cycle of paying costs that are pretty unfortunate and ultimately making players unhappy. At the end of the day, BNR is a tool for making fun formats. And when unbans go great, it's certainly a tool in the belt. Is unbanning cards, but it is something we do deliberately and with intention, and not because we're pretty sure it'll be okay.
Yeah, and something I want to say is the intentionality that goes behind a lot of our ban and unban decisions is an important thing to look at, where I'll say I think that Modern has looked pretty great since Pro Tour Edge of Eternity. Like, Pro Tour Edge of Eternity was one of the best Modern Pro Tours we've had in terms of deck diversity, in terms of the format being perfectly fine and fun to play after that. We saw a lot of change where Belcher kind of fell off a bit. Boros Energy did pretty bad at that Pro Tour. Now we're back talking about how strong Boros Energy is, despite not a ton of cards being added to the format, at least in the way that you would see from like a Horizons level set or something to that effect. So in a lot of ways, we see a format that has, I'm going to say this a bunch of times, that upper level of what you want to see from a non-rotating format. Then a bunch of different things you can play under that. And Modern in particular is a spot where I would say one of our driving philosophies behind the format is that we wanted to have the fun and power and staying power in particular of a non-rotating format, but because it is our premier non-rotating format, it needs to be able to withstand competitive pressure and have the churn of a place like Standard, which has rotation and all kinds of other churn tools going on to make it so different decks are the good ones to play over time. There are worlds where the format can become stale and people are tired of it and it's not fun anymore, and that speaks to what Jade was getting at a little bit earlier, where ban and restricted lists are a tool to make sure that players are having a good time. We've seen unbans with the big unbans, what, year and a half-ish ago at this point?
Yeah, time's a construct. I have no clue.
That was a spot where we recognized players were not having a good time. Modern was not something that was fun for players, and so we took a really big swing because the risk in there was this goes bad, people still aren't having a bad time, we're figuring it out. This goes well, people are having a good time. And it mostly looks like Modern has been a spot for people to have a good time for the last year or so, which makes us reticent to make changes, especially whenever unbans are something that I would say the number of times we can push that button is finite.
It's finite, yeah.
So that's a spot where I would personally rather deploy that when we need to do it, whenever we say, oh, I think Uro is one that's come up a lot recently. If we thought decks were way too fast in the format, that's a spot where we could look at pulling out things like Uro. I think Dig Through Time is one I've seen before as well, where these are cards that pressure towards longer games a little bit. that's a spot where we would want to figure out, great, what are cards that we can unban in order to try and make Modern a more fun place to play?
Yeah.
I am getting some number of notes from people around. I've certainly heard it that people are kind of tired of how long Boros Energy has been the deck to play. So again, we do have our eyes on the situation as it's unfolding, but I'm really interested in seeing how it plays out on the tabletop level.
Okay. All right, let's quickly do Legacy and Vintage so we can get to some questions. Legacy. So there were a number of things talked about in the article. So let's quickly cover the last couple months, and then I want to talk about Oops All Spells.
Okay, definitely. So the last few months, we saw Nadu and Entomb get banned back November-ish, I believe it was. Time, constructs, etc. And whenever that happens, whenever something that fundamental to Legacy shifts at one time, you'll see a lot of faster linear decks become the biggest thing to do. Usually there's one sort of disruptive aggro deck that ends up being strong. And I think we've seen that play out a couple of different times now. But when that did happen, we saw blue-black, mid-range, Dimir Tempo, what have you, ended up being sort of the top fair deck. This was similar to the Reanimator Shells or the Reanimatorless Reanimator deck that we were seeing towards the end of that season. And then Oops All Spells, Mono Red Prison, a lot of these decks ended up being really the things that people immediately went to when they were seeking higher ground. In the few months since then, I think we've seen games really start to decompress in a way that is a lot of fun and lets you play with more cards that people would expect you to get to play with in Legacy. Something I really spent a lot of time highlighting in the article in particular was the amount that white has started to return to the metagame is something that's heartening. I think for the most part, what we saw white doing in the, we'll say the Entomb era or the late stages of the Entomb era was mostly prop up a lot of artifact shells and give you some splash tools. But recently we've seen a lot of things like the Boros Energy package in Legacy, ironically backed up with Legacy-powered disruption like Cabal Therapy, like Wasteland, like Swords to Plowshares. Death and Taxes won a Legacy showcase recently. If anyone can attest to this in chat, I was playing up the Beanstalk queues on Magic Online yesterday. I think I played 2 leagues or something like that, one with Leyline Binding, one without. Seeing games become less about the first 3 turns, where you do sort of have those early checks that you'd expect in Legacy, where Force of Will is king.
Yep.
But also, I find myself sideboarding out a lot of my forces and ending up in spots where you can expect a game to last 8-9 turns. You're seeing people deploying creatures and using their interactive spells to trade with what's on the battlefield rather than it being about a singular combo as often. So I don't think that Legacy is in a perfect spot this second, but it feels like we are on a pathway that leads to a really good spot for Legacy. And Legacy is a format that historically has taken a long time to evolve. Just the iterative cycle takes a little bit longer with something like that. So at this point, I really don't think that we should be making changes to the format, and we should be watching it play out.
Okay. So let's talk about Oops All Spells quickly. It seems like every BNR we get questions about that deck. But I believe you have a pretty firm view on Oops All Spells.
Yeah, so this is one where I'm just going to share an anecdote. So as some people may or may not be aware, I end up doing coverage for a lot of our regional championships in the United States. They have us fly in on Thursday for those. We do a tech check on Friday, where the wonderful people on the tech side of those things actually structured when our tech check meeting is. So I can play Legacy all day Friday at these things, which means that I get to interact with some amount of the players. I'm usually masked, and a bunch of the times they don't know who I am, but we're just talking and hanging out, which is pretty awesome experience, actually. But I get to interact with players in Houston, in Portland, and I could list off all of the different venues, but it ends up being different crowds. And something that has come up for me multiple times, it actually came up most recently in the sort of win and prize event, or the last round, where if I won, I got prizes, and if I lost, I did not get prizes. I played against someone on Oops All Spells, where we sit down and they flip around their MDFC land and they go, yeah, I'm playing this, I'm sorry. They're really apologetic about it. And after the games, I just say, it's not a problem. Whatever, your deck does what it does. Legacy is a place where bad things can happen to you. And my opponent goes, yeah, I just love playing Legacy, and if this deck didn't exist, I don't know if I'd be able to play Legacy at all. And that has happened to me in tabletop events, I would say twice in the last year, and in pretty different regions. And I think it is really hard for me. We've talked a bunch of times on here about having to use the banned and restricted list to balance for multiple different worlds. It is really hard for me to reconcile sort of the digital experience of playing against Oops All Spells, which I don't think it's very good, and I certainly appreciate that that is good, with the tabletop experience of it, where I feel like it is a lot of people's ticket to playing Legacy at all. And I really want people to be able to play Legacy with other people who play Legacy in real life, especially whenever you look at places like Eternal Weekend events, where I'm not going to mince words. The win rate of Oops All Spells at most Eternal Weekend events is not good. It is really bad relative to a deck that you see played as much as it is on Magic Online. There may be externalities related to that I'm interested in if people have takes on them. And earnestly, I'm really happy to engage in good faith on this stuff. But I really feel like the deck, it is hard for me to not feel as if the deck can be beat if you really want to beat it. It's not very fun to play against online, but it is the way that people can play Legacy. And I really care a lot that those people continue to play Legacy, as I believe that making sure that people can play is part of what keeps tabletop Legacy alive.
All right, we're going to touch on Vintage real quick. If you have any questions, tag at Magic in the chat. I've seen some so far. Some of them we've covered in different places, so I may point people to different sections as we get through those. But let's touch on Vintage real quick, and then we'll answer what questions we can.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Vintage is in a great spot right now. This is one where I think Luris has largely been accepted as sort of one of the pillars on the level of Mishra's Workshop, Bazaar, etc. There are a bunch of different flavors of it, just like you would see from either of those cards. And it's gotten a pretty steady drip of 1, 2, 3 cards from each set to think about. I know I've seen Sewer Valence Kim show up in Legacy as well as Vintage because of what you can do with a Goblin Welder in that card, which is pretty sweet. Overall, the format in the last year has looked really, really good. I've even seen content of people saying that they thought Vintage is a lot of fun to play right now. So at the risk of sounding a certain kind of way, the water's warm, jump in, give it a try.
All right, let's get into questions. Okay, so I keep seeing questions about why haven't you addressed Boros Energy in Modern. Carmen did, and it's possible you missed that. That's totally fine. About the metagame share. So there was a discussion Carmen went through on Amulet Titan, Boros Energy, how that plays out differently in the real world versus on MitGo formats. It's interesting. We had a related conversation a few weeks ago around data, around how the data for online events is there's just more of it. Because it's easier to collect, and there's not as much for tabletop events. We get some of that, and it's a balancing act. I'm wondering, maybe just talk about that overall, since we talked about Boros Energy specifically, but how do you all think about the breadth of digital data versus tabletop data?
Even some of that can be really interesting, where I personally have benefited a lot from how public Magic Online's data is, for example, and think that it's a great place for ideas. I would personally caution against it treating it as the absolute truth of what the entire metagame looks like, especially as you look at formats like Standard and Pioneer that are also available on Arena, which I believe Arena gives a lot more data that just isn't public facing. Tabletop is that, but a step even further than that, where the amount of people who are playing tabletop Modern, for example, absolutely dwarfs the number of people who are playing it on Magic Online. And I'm going to say this a lot, have said it a lot, will say it probably every single one of these that I'm on. A lot of these banned and restricted lists have to serve a ton of different audiences. And so it can be really hard, where a lot of people on Magic Online want something different out of Modern than people who are playing at a local game store. And making sure that people at a local game store can spend time trading for all of the cards they need for their decks and the like is going to also be something that we have to factor in, whereas a lot of people on Magic Online kind of want something that changes more rapidly, which we have to figure out how often do we need to change things to make sure that our most enfranchised players are happy.
Yep. Can we get confirmation that the next BNR will be May 18th per the tentative BNR? Gosh, I don't have a calendar in front of it, but
That's what I said on the internet based on an interaction we had.
if that, I'll say this, if that is what we put on the tentative graphic, then I believe that is correct. Yeah.
I believe that is correct. It's, I want to say 11-ish days before a couple of spotlights.
Yeah.
But we can, I'm sure we can.
We'll chat, but I believe if that's what we put on the graphic, I believe we have not changed anything from when we put that graphic up.
I
So
agree
yes,
with
I
you.
believe that is correct.
Yeah, I think our tentative graphic had December question marks and otherwise we're
Yep.
planning to stay true.
Yep. So I think so. Yeah. Again, so questions on when are you going to hold more events on this or that format? They have conversations with those teams, but that is a different team, and it is duly noted that it would be good to have them come on and talk. I did chat with that team this morning, and they're working on upcoming schedules, but we don't have anything to announce there yet. We talked about unbans in Modern in the Modern section. And again, the questions, you might just have missed that part of the stream. You might have tuned in late. I get that. Are you guys open and willing to do an emergency unban of 4 or so cards in Modern? I would say, I'm going to speak for him, I'm going to say probably not. No. Yeah, there's no
go
emergency.
ahead and say no. I don't know what the emergency is.
Yeah.
I think Boros is probably a larger part of the metagame than we would like today.
Yeah.
It is not clear to me that that will always be true. Happy to see it play out in tabletop, but I think you need a position where you have something in the vein of Nadu or how big Vivi was to necessitate emergency action, and in that case it's more likely that you see a ban than unbans to try and correct it, because that just raises if the way you're addressing an emergency situation is with unbans, you're actually just raising the power level of the entire format, and you're not actually making it that much more accessible to other decks. You're just creating new things that are maybe too strong.
Yeah. All right. I think that is, and there are questions that I'm not answering. They're not answered for various reasons. Either they're not on topic or it's a different team or anything like that. So I think we've answered all the questions we can answer, which makes sense. It was a light announcement, but thank you for coming in and sharing your views on the format right now as how things stand. Thank you all for tuning in and sharing your questions and thoughts. We are going to be back next week with the debut for Secrets of Strixhaven. We're very excited about that one. Return to set, a lot of cool things coming back, a lot of new twists, a lot of really interesting stuff. So tune in right here next week, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And again, time is a construct, so you'll figure it out. You're smart people.
+1 for each artifact you control.
Oh my gosh. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.